Welcome to the Harry Bridges School of Labor, presented by Labor United Educational League. Our purpose is to educate the workers of America on the strength of unions and to foster a class-conscious workforce. We aim to connect the struggles of the past with the struggles of today to empower the labor movement to transform itself from the present hopeless defensive fight into an aggressive attack upon capital. We plan to empower workers with knowledge, regardless of industry or type of work, bringing all workers to a class-oriented trade union movement. So once again, tonight's History of the CIO Part 3, and it's our second part on the Flint Sit-Down Strike. And what we'll be learning today, we're going to go with the first section will be on the Battle of Bull's Run and the beginning of negotiations. Our second section will be GM's counterattacks and the sit-downers take Chevy #1. And then, of course, our third section will be the workers win.
All right, Battle of Bull's Run. On the afternoon of January 11th, as workers were handing food in through the main gate of Fisher Body #2, company guards suddenly appeared and overpowered them, closing the gate of the smaller plant. The workers quickly ran a ladder to hoist the food to the second floor, but the guards hauled it down. At that moment, in 16-degree weather, the company turned off the heat. Word was sent to union headquarters and hundreds of workers raced to the scene. Some were from Buick and Chevy, some were bus drivers who had been helped by the auto workers during their recent strike, some were, quote, flying squads in town from Toledo and Norwood, Ohio to help out. The ever-present sound truck appeared in front of the plant. Immediately, 20 outside pickets, Fisher #2 workers, advanced on the company guards with homemade billy clubs, took their keys, and captured the gate to guard against city cops entering. Company guards phoned the Flint cops, barricading themselves in the plant's ladies' room, claiming they were kidnapped. It became obvious that the whole provocation had been prearranged. The cops arrived in minutes, loaded down with revolvers, gas guns, grenades, and supplies of tear and nauseating gas. They blockaded the streets, removed parked cars, and then attacked the pickets guarding the gate. Women pickets deposited their children at the Union Hall and raced to the plant. When the first gas bombs were thrown, the pickets outside retreated temporarily. The wind blew the gas back into the cops' ranks. Inside the plant, the sit-downers dragged fire hoses to the windows and began firing water at the advancing cops. 2-pound door hinges began raining down from the roof. Within 5 minutes, the cops retreated. The sit-downers started hauling out a supply of empty milk bottles and hinges to the pickets outside, preparing for a second attack. The cops began hurling gas bombs through the plant windows, which were not as well fortified as at Fisher #1. The workers grabbed them with gloved hands and quickly doused them in buckets of water located nearby for that purpose. The cops then regrouped and made a second rush, but were met with a volley of bottles, hinges, and lumps of coal outside and water from the inside hoses. They couldn't get close this time. The sound truck, manned by several organizers, was helping to direct the battle amid a barrage of tear gas. Again, the cops retreated, this time with the workers in hot pursuit. The counterattack was led by Travis, who was later treated for gas burns. The pickets were joined by scores of other workers who were part of a crowd watching the battle. At that point, the cops opened fire. 14 were wounded, one, a leader of the bus drivers union, critically. While fellow workers carried them off, the rest continued on the attack, overturning the sheriff's car with the sheriff inside, and spilling large quantities of gas and gas grenades out of the trunk. The cops continued to retreat up the hill, shooting at the window of the plant. One woman, Janora Johnson, whose husband was inside the plant, grabbed the mic in the sound truck and cried, "Cowards, cowards, shooting unarmed and defenseless men. Women of Flint, this is your fight. Join the picket line and defend your jobs, your husband's jobs, and your children's home." Victor Ruther, manning the sound truck, pointed out that it was not the peaceful workers, but GM's cops who were responsible for the destruction. He told the workers that, quote, they must now fight not only for their jobs, but for their very lives. Let General Motors be warned. Patience of these men is not inexhaustible. If there is further bloodshed, we will not be responsible for what the workers do in their rage. There are costly machines in that plant. Let the corporation and their thugs remember that. The workers outside barricaded both ends of the plant with abandoned cars. Governor Frank Murphy arrived in Flint and said he was holding the National Guard in readiness, but GM's strategy had failed for the moment. Attempting to counteract the character of a peaceful sit-down, it had provoked violence at Fisher No. 2, much smaller than its sister plant. It wanted to create a situation whereby the Guard would be ordered in and martial law declared. Its hope was to starve out the workers and eventually evict them, thereby giving impetus to a back-to-work movement led by the Flint Alliance. The courage, organization, and solidarity of the workers had overcome this strategy. The Battle of Bull's Run, as it later came to be known, had ended. The, quote, Bulls had run. Women's Emergency Brigade is formed. One of the results of the victory of Bull's Run was the new importance it gave to women in the strike. Up to that time, though joining outside picket lines, most had been involved in preparing food. Many wives of sit-downers had been the victims of malicious anonymous letters telling them their husbands inside the plant were sick. Some women were tricked into demanding that their husbands and sons be brought home, but Bull's Run turned the tide. Jenora Johnson, who had spoken out so militantly in the heat of the battle, began organizing the Women's Emergency Brigade as a vanguard detachment of the Women's Auxiliary. It was composed of volunteers, mostly veterans of the previous battle, organized along semi-military lines. Squad captains, usually those with phones and cars, were leaders of groups of women whom they were expected to round up for any emergency on a moment's notice and transport to the scene of action. One failure to respond meant suspension from the brigade. The CIO joins the fight. With the help of the CIO's Philip Murray, an end was being sought to the glass industry strike, which would enable Chrysler and Ford production to shoot back up. This would put pressure on GM, where production had sunk from 50,000 to 1,500 cars per week. The union took the offensive. CIO President Lewis launched a broadside against the corporation, demanding an investigation of its ownership. He pledged full CIO support until the auto workers won their strike, realizing the noticeable effect it was having on the steel organizing campaign. Flying squads of organizers were signing up thousands of steel workers into the CIO's Steel Workers Organizing Committee. On January 13th, Murphy called both sides into conference, and 2 days later, GM agreed to a truce. National bargaining would begin on the 18th, solely with the UAW on all 8 issues. 17 struck plants would remain closed pending a settlement. There would be no discrimination against any worker because of union membership. Neither side could break off negotiations for at least 15 days. The sit-downers would evacuate the plants before the 18th, but GM would not remove tools, dies, or materials from any of the struck plants. The key issue was that the UAW would be the sole bargaining agent. The rank-and-file sit-downers didn't like the smell of it, although GM had finally been forced to sign something. Prior to that, the corporation said they would not even negotiate unless the plants were evacuated first, and had always maintained that the UAW only represented a small, quote, minority. Travis and the Flint leadership had not been involved in the negotiations leading to this agreement and didn't like it either. They felt it put GM on the offensive again, since with every passing day in the 15-day period, there would be increasing pressure on the union to accept less and less of what it wanted before GM would be able to break off negotiations. GM violates the agreement. For the rank and file, it, quote, was difficult to accept a truce, rather than definite victory and outright union recognition. Nevertheless, plans were made for Fisher No. 1 and 2 to march out in a body on Sunday, January 17th, after a special chicken dinner inside. Everything was cleaned up, the workers had their bags packed, and Fisher number 1 was about ready to parade to the buses that would take them to number 2 for a mass demonstration when the hitch came. Bill Lawrence, a United Press reporter, happened to hand Henry Krause a press release which he had taken from George Boyson's desk and asked for the union's comment. The release, scheduled for issuance after the evacuation of the plant, announced that GM had agreed to meet with the Flint Alliance on Tuesday to discuss, quote, representation and recognition by the company. This was a direct violation of the agreement to bargain solely with the UAW. The workers respond. Travis sent runners immediately to both body plants to halt the evacuations while the workers discussed the new turn of events. Although UAW President Martin, when notified, saw, quote, nothing wrong in the development, CIO Director Brophy and Vice President Mortimer agreed with Travis's move. When the proposal was made to remain inside Fisher number 1, the workers cheered. A welcoming crowd of 5,000 outside applauded wildly when they heard the decision, 10 minutes after the sit-downers had been scheduled to leave. Horns honked for 5 minutes as the men lined the windows of the plant, waving to their families and fellow strikers. A dummy figure labeled GM Stool Pigeon was lowered to the ground and torn to shreds. Another rally of 10,000 at Fisher number 2 also cheered Mortimer's announcement that the sit-downers had decided to stick it out in the face of GM's double cross. There was a victory air at Pengelly Hall. The strike and the union had suddenly attained full maturity. The workers felt GM couldn't bargain with two unions. You can't have an 8-hour shift on one end of the assembly line and 6 on the other. GM then walked out of the negotiations, and the workers tightened their lines once more. It was back to scratch again. GM opened a strike-breaking drive. Economic conditions were worsening, a time when anti-strike movements flourish. While the UAW was fighting to relieve these hardships by getting relief for its members and was signing up new members all the time, the corporation launched its drive. It announced that 79% of its workers had, quote, voted to return to work. Since GM was very concerned about its workers, it would make work for them and get them off welfare. On the 25th, the union responded with a strike in the Oakland plant, one of the few places where actual assembly work was taking place.
And with that, we'll break for our first round of questions and comments. One thing I would like to note, as you can see throughout this struggle, especially Bull's Run and its aftermath, a lot of this leadership of the strike didn't come from the leaders of the union. In fact, the president of the UAW was completely against the strike. The leadership came from the rank and file. And it's a great example of what a vast, strong rank and file union can do today.
One thing that always strikes me when you read about these old strikes and you look to today is there was a lot of courage that people had to take these actions, to literally go up against the cops, to get physical. Something that I think a lot of people would cause a lot of people pause today. Maybe in some way that there's been a lot more conditioning of people to not want to stand up for themselves today. It amazes me the lengths that people, they still do it today, but when you read it, it's just on a whole other level in what happened in the past.
I could add a anecdotal story to this. So I'm a bus driver here in New York City. We work under what's called the Taylor Law, which is essentially a state version of the National Labor Relations Act. Because we're public sector, we don't fall under that. But there is one key difference: we're not allowed to strike. But in recent, I've been working without a contract for, at this point, a year and a month. Exactly 1 week from today will be a year and a month. And for the last 2 years, one thing I was pushing for is we should strike. And of course, the union leadership's response has always been Taylor law, we can't strike. And I was like, yes, but I brought up one key point, and this is a point that was brought up by my former international president of my union, who's also the former president of my local, who passed in 2019, Larry Hanley. The Janus decision, this is a Supreme Court decision. Yes, it's an anti-labor decision, but it essentially outlawed anti-strike laws for the public sector because it ruled that our relationship is a First Amendment relationship. So we have precedent where we could fight it in court, and that's been my argument. And my now former vice president said straight up to me, as long as I'm vice president, we're not doing it. Because I lived through the last strike, I don't want to do another one. And when it came to my union leadership, he was the most militant of the union leadership. So that shows you where we are as the labor movement. And I see that a lot of workers are ready to strike. It's the leadership that prevents it when the time is ready to come. And they're not scared of the police assaults with gas cans. They're not fired. They're not scared of these essentially wars that took place then. They're scared of fines.
Yeah, something that just came to mind was, I do see some parallels, especially with what you mentioned, Scott. There seems to be always this, even back then and even today, there seems to always be this constant pressure from even union leadership, which should be on, you would think on the side of the workers to always make deals with the company or to, discourage militancy in the workers type of thing. I guess, I don't know. It makes you wonder, how do I know we've talked about this in the past, combating it with having a strong rank and file, but yeah, I don't know. It's unfortunate that, we still have a problem with it today, and I see it in so many unions. Unfortunately, I wish I had that, obviously an easy answer for it, but
Yeah, it is one of the pitfalls we face. Unfortunately, the union leadership is entrenched and they don't want to ruin their relationship with the boss. I could give another example in my local. Our current financial secretary, on one side of his mouth, will talk about how his relationship with the boss is hand in glove, so to speak. And then when we call out the relationship with the boss is that they're too close, he's like, "Oh no, we're not close with them." Same guy says both things openly, and as long as uh nobody's there to organize the members.
GM counterattacks and sit-downers take Chevy number 4. Vigilantes smashed UAW headquarters at Anderson, Indiana, and ran the union organizers out of town. 5 pickets were clubbed by cops on a line in front of the Cadillac plant in Detroit. Mrs. Agnes Gotten, wife of a striker, sought to block police from escorting scabs inside and was clubbed from behind, requiring 5 stitches in her head. But 1,500 pickets succeeded in preventing any strikebreakers from entering, despite the presence of 200 hose-carrying cops. The Flint Alliance met to whip up a frenzy against the strikers. The state legislature sponsored a bill to outlaw sit-down strikes. The Alliance besieged 4 union officials in Saginaw and beat them up, nearly murdering them. Finally, on the 27th, GM reopened non-struck plants, mostly in Chevrolet, employing 40,000 workers. Although it had closed them to throw workers on the streets and blame the UAW, it was now opening them with no real chance of assembling cars. But the corporation wasn't content with these countermoves. It sought out a judge who didn't own GM stock and filed an injunction, on grounds, true of course, that it was losing money to Ford and Chrysler. It demanded immediate evacuation of the Fisher body plants and prohibition of outside picketing. On February 1st, the union was served with a show cause order to explain why it should not bow to the injunction. GM had effectively seized the offensive. It had reopened its non-striking plants, and the union appeared powerless to prevent it. Having passed its peak, the union would inevitably fall back and grow weaker, with the chance that the strike might be lost or demands watered down beyond recognition, unless a counteroffensive were launched. That is what Travis and the strikers produced. Sit-downers take Chevy number 4. Across Chevrolet Avenue, from Fisher Body number 2, spread out on 80 acres and bisected by the Flint River, stood 9 Chevrolet factories. At 3:30 every afternoon, 7,000 night shift workers replaced the 7,000 on the day shift. Half of the 14,000 total worked in one factory, Chevy number 4, the motor assembly plant which produced all 1 million Chevrolet engines each year. It was the largest single unit of the GM empire. To seize it would remove the struggle from the courts and put it back in the plants where workers had an even chance. Yet to capture it appeared nearly impossible. The plant superintendent, Stormtrooper Arnold Lenz, had instituted a reign of terror. He had concentrated an army of armed guards inside to patrol day and night. The union was growing, and Lenz was firing workers left and right for union activities. As it happened, the union had uncovered a Pinkerton agent, Frenchy Dubuc, and was holding and using him to get information. Travis ordered the stoolie to call his Pinkerton boss and tell him that Travis had asked him directly about Chevy number 4, about the docks, the approaches, etc. The Pinkerton boss told Dubuc that Travis was kidding him. He knows goddamn well the union couldn't take Chevy 4. Travis now established in his own mind that GM was confident the union would not be so foolhardy as to try to sit down in number 4. Lenz fired 3 more men for union activities on Friday, January 29th. Travis called a Chevrolet membership meeting for Sunday night, and 1,500 workers responded. He told them the situation, outlined the goon attacks, and said the union must demand that the UAW members be rehired. The meeting roared approval. He then told the workers to keep your eyes open and you'll know what to do. The meeting was adjourned, but 150 stewards and organizers were told to remain. Travis, Krause, and Roy Ruther went into a nearby darkened room, lightened only by a candle. The 3-man committee selected 30 of the most trusted, sending the rest home with the directions, secret orders, follow the man who takes the lead. The 30 who remained were told that at exactly 3:20 the next afternoon, there would be a sit-down in Chevy number 9. Those in Chevy plants number 4 and 6 were told to sit tight and remain at work. Travis then took aside the 2 most trusted union leaders from number 9 and told them that they had to hold the plant until just 4:10, until Chevy number 6 was taken, that it was the real target. Meanwhile, Travis had told 3 leaders from number 6 and number 4 that number 9 was only a decoy, that the men in number 6 were to go to number 4 and help pull it down. Thus, only 6 people knew that number 4 was the actual target. The 30 select few were told about the plan to take number 9 with the idea that the plan to take number 9 would be all over the company in the morning. The only way to defeat the company's stool pigeon system was to use it, to go through an intricate, elaborate secret procedure with darkened rooms, secret orders on slips of paper, and the rest. Travis believed Lenz would believe the plan because of the extreme measures taken to keep it a secret, and second because Lenz and the Pinkertons were sure the union would never make an attempt to capture the impregnable number 4. Travis was counting on the GM spy system to give the company the wrong information. In this manner, number 9 was set up as a decoy to draw all the company guards away from number 4 and allow its seizure by the workers. The next afternoon, at the very moment the hearings were taking place on GM's injunction, Travis called a mass meeting at the Union Hall, billed as a mobilization for a protest march on the courthouse. Thousands showed up, and the Women's Emergency Brigade appeared in force. Meanwhile, the Union sound truck circled the city, surrounded by Union guards, and finally, through devious routes, at 3:05 came to rest facing number 9 and number 6. 5 minutes later, at the Union Hall, Dorothy Krause rushed up to Travis breathlessly and handed him a slip of paper. Travis turned to the crowd and said, "They're beating up our boys at Chevy 9. I suggest we go right down there." Unknown to the workers, the slip of paper was blank. The workers were at number 9 in a few minutes. Newsmen who had been tipped off earlier were already there. And sure enough, there was trouble. Linz had fallen into the trap completely. The entire armed force from the whole Chevrolet division had been stationed at the personnel building next to number 9. At 3:20, when the night shift marched in yelling "strike," the guards closed the doors and rushed in. The outnumbered workers fought valiantly. When the whistle blew at 3:30, the fighting was at its fiercest. The men were using anything they could lay their hands on against the goons' clubs and gas guns. At 3:45, the plant manager at number 4 ran down the lines, tapping all the company men and ordering them to number 9, leaving number 4 virtually devoid of any pro-company force. Meanwhile, at number 6, just as the 3:30 whistle blew, Ed Kronk picked up a lead pipe and, waving an American flag, started running through the plant yelling, "Shut her off and follow me," banging the pipe to attract attention over the roar of the plant's machinery. With 35 men, he jogged over to number 4, 300 yards away. Kermit Johnson, waiting at the door of number 4, to tell him he had failed to get a strike started. The plan had been fouled up. Kronk then turned back to number 6 for reinforcements. There he found Carl Bubber's powerful group of 100 dockmen and another group of 50 marching in all directions, shutting down the plant. They had assumed that number 6 was the real target. With Kronk's 35 men back to help, number 6 was shut down immediately. They then turned their sights back on number 4. When they arrived in number 4, there was virtually no opposition except for a few foremen and bosses. The workers split into 2 groups, one moving to the test division, the other down the motor lines, threading in and out among the machines, yelling, exhorting, reaching for switches. Many workers, being threatened with dismissal by foremen and straw bosses, wavered as union men marched around shouting, "Strike is on! Come and help us!" As the number of strikers grew, courage added to courage. There was practically no physical violence. The plant guards returning from Chevy 9 after the battle tried to enter by the northeast gate, but the men drove them off with pistons, connecting rods, and rocker arm rods, while others brought fire hoses and squirted water and foamite at the would-be invaders. By this time, pickets and a sound truck came over from Fisher number 2 across Chevrolet Avenue. A member of the Women's Emergency Brigade jumped to the mic and reported that the women from Chevy number 9's battle had gone to the auxiliary hall to wipe their eyes clear of the tear gas and will soon be back. We don't want violence. We're going to protect our husbands. The Women's Emergency Brigade stood outside the plant, blocking entrances. If any cops or troops were to attempt to break into the plant, it was plain they would first have to go through these women's bodies. Not one attempt was made as the women entrenched themselves, preparing to stay the night. At 4:45 p.m. on February 1st, Chevrolet Plant Number 4, producer of 1 million motors a year, largest unit in the worldwide General Motors empire, impregnable against attack, had been secured by the men of the UAW CIO. The women were standing in front of them, daring any cop, company goon, or National Guardsman to retake it. The brilliant plan conceived by Travis and the ingenuity and heroism of the strikers had stabbed at the very heart of the billion-dollar auto giant. Governor Murphy ordered the National Guard into the area around Chevy number 4. They were partly under the command of Captain Henry McNaughton, who had served in the U.S. force that had invaded the Soviet Union after World War I. The troops took possession of all streets and approaches, isolating both the Chevy plant and Fisher Body number 2 across the street. Virtual martial law was declared. Guards with fixed bayonets surrounded number 4. 8 machine guns and 37mm howitzers were mounted on the hill overlooking both plants. Tear gas was held in reserve. No one was allowed into the plants, which effectively shut off the food supply. Fissure number 2 was completely sealed off from both union contact and from visits by the strikers' families. An injunction signed by Judge Gladola on February 2nd ordered the workers to abandon the plants or face ejection in 24 hours. The writ also forbade street picketing. The Women's Emergency Brigade was forced out of the area. Then the heat was shut off in the 2 plants. The workers immediately threatened to start huge bonfires to warm themselves. On went the heat. Next, the lights were shut off. Again, the workers warned that every one of the 3,000 men now inside would light a torch of waste paper in order to see. On went the lights. On February 3rd, the National Guard was forced to lift the food ban under dire threats of damage inside the plants. This war on nerves was too much for GM. With hundreds of millions of dollars worth of machinery at stake, on February 4th, it agreed to resume negotiations. By agreeing to talk while the workers remained in possession of the plants, the corporation was making a fundamental concession. Earlier, it had refused to negotiate unless the plants were evacuated.
And with that, we'll break for our second round of questions and comments.
First of all, what we just saw was just amazingly inspiring, that the battles that people went through. I'm also in a public sector union where it's against the law to strike. And we have a bit of a different advantage in that each local has a lot of autonomy, and there are 300 locals in the state. They can pretty much overcome the bosses. The bosses in that case are just like field reps who come in, and the field reps didn't want these current wave of. We've had 4 strikes in the last 2 years, I think, and the field reps were against it too, just like you were saying with your bosses being against it. And ultimately, it was just people realizing that they had the power to do that, and there's no law that can prevent workers from taking that power once they get organized and have the ability to do that, which is very difficult, of course. I've never done it myself in my local. We never even came close. But all power to you. And what we've seen is that the public really jumps on our side when we go to do this. And so that's one way, another way of convincing your leadership or getting new leadership to be on your side. Thank you.
And yeah, I think everybody here agrees about how inspiring what we just went through was. I know myself, as soon as I heard say this, read the sentence that at 4:45 p.m. on February 1st, talking about the taking of Chevy number 4, I got goosebumps all across my body. That's how inspiring it was to me.
Yeah, I just wanted to say great class. I was wondering though, is there any more kind of like resources that we could find as far as like a book or something, kind of giving more of a background on this or like a deeper dive into it?
I have a PDF of the pamphlet. I could always send it over to you. That's where we got a lot of this from. There's also, of course, I don't remember offhand exactly where in Philip Foner's History of the American Labor Movement. I'm sure they go into this. We also have the history of the CIO. I think it was called the CIO 1935 to 1955. It was like an 800-page book. I'm sure you can find in there, and there's a lot on the Flint Sit-Down Strike, and you can find a lot online. This was a seminal moment in the labor movement, and there's a lot you can find there. And there was just one other thing I wanted to mention, and it was from the first section, and I wanted to attach that to modern times, where it was mentioned when Philip Murray from the CIO stepped in and was working to bring about an end to the glass industry strike that was going on at the time, which would enable Chrysler and Ford to pick up production to pressure GM. A similar tactic was used in the sit-down strike, in the stand-up strike last year. Essentially, I forget which one was the first one to agree to terms, because it was the first time all 3 went out at the same time. Essentially what happened was, usually in most cases, I would be against, I know personally, bringing the workers off the picket line as soon as without them agreeing to the new contract. But what this did was it forced the other two automakers who were way still far off on negotiations, essentially within a week, forced them to capitulate and take the same deal as the other unions. Because now it forced that now they were losing money to their competitors, and they had no choice but to take the deal, and if they wanted to pick back production back up. And I also like to add on our publication Labor Today, we had an analysis of the stand-up strike. I will get a link to it. I'll put it in the chat here for anybody to grab it and read it if they wish. But with that, if there's no other questions or comments, we'll go to our final section of the evening.
The workers win. Negotiations resume. On February 7th, CIO President John Lewis joined the talks in Detroit, along with Mortimer and attorney Lee Pressman. Mortimer replaced UAW President Martin, who had been sent on a tour to prevent him from fouling up negotiations. The union reduced its recognition, reduced its recognition demand to one of sole bargaining agent in the 20 struck plants, which included the key ones and agent for its members only in the rest. The tension continued to mount. The sheriff read the injunction order on the sit-downers, demanding they leave the plants. After the workers refused, he asked Murphy for aid in ousting them and arresting their leaders. By now, Fisher number 1, free from guard patrol, 2 miles from the besieged plants, had 3,000 men on the inside. Murphy kept holding off, hoping he could get an agreement, maintaining an untarnished image. But the company forces would not let him rest easily. City officials continued to recruit vigilantes. By February 8th, there existed an armed force of 4,000 National Guardsmen, 1,000 deputized vigilantes, the Flint Cops, and the Flint Alliance, all ready to move, end quote. The Michigan Sheriff's Association offered 1,300 additional deputies. The vigilantes were being put through, quote, dress rehearsals, end quote, by the sheriff and city officials. The plans were discussed about how to oust the strikers. The question arose among the union strategists of what to do in case of a full-scale attack. Initially, when the Guard had surrounded the 2 plants, Walter Reuther, or if that's how you say that, in parentheses, future UAW president, close parentheses, argued for the workers not to resist the Guards actively, but to sprawl out on the floors and force the troops to carry them bodily out of the plant. Robert Travis then responded that the workers need to be prepared to fight. He stated, quote, "We fought the cops, we fought the company thugs, and now we have to fight the National Guard too. The way we did in Toledo." End quote. No one challenged this strategy. The workers inside both Fisher body plants sent a telegram to Governor Murphy to warn him against putting the National Guard in action. Quote, "The police of the city of Flint belong to General Motors. The sheriff of Genesee County, belongs to General Motors. The judges of Genesee County belong to General Motors. It remains to be seen whether the governor of the state also belongs to General Motors. Governor, we have decided to stay in the plant. We have no illusions about the sacrifices which this decision will entail. We fully expect that if violent effort is made to oust us, many of us will be killed, and we will take this means of making it known to our wives, to our children, and to the people of the state of Michigan and to our country that if this result follows from the attempt to eject us, you are the one who must be held responsible for our deaths." That is empowering. Holy crap. That was the answer of the strikers inside. Outside, the preparations were no less militant. Travis had requested mass assistance from a possible shutdown or showdown, excuse me. Locals inside Toledo home base immediately began sending 500 to 1,000 men ready to remain in Flint at least an entire week. Autolite and other plants shut down because so many workers had left their jobs to go and aid the brothers and sisters in Flint. Cars were steaming in from all over Michigan. Thousands of workers were pouring over the roads leading from Detroit to the embattled workers. 10,000 came from that city's Dodge and Chrysler plants alone. Keasley Hayes had to shut its doors because the workers were marching to Fisher Body, and 20,000 of Flint's own had began massing at the two body plants. Chevy number 4 had been captured after the injunction had been issued and therefore was not included in the ouster order. Negotiations continued. Governor Murphy had reached the end of his rope. On the evening of February 10th, he brought the injunction order to Lewis's hotel room to tell him it would be served to oust the sit-downers. Lewis replied that if that happened, he would march straight to the plant and go inside to face the National Guard along with the workers. 65. With tens of thousands of workers in Flint surrounding the plant, surrounding the plants refusing to surrender, with the heat and light at Chevy 4 turned off on February 9th and 10th, and nearly 5,000 sit-downers prepared to fight, quote, fight to the death, end quote.
On February 11th, the 44th day of the sit-down, General Motors gave up. It signed a contract with the UAW, recognizing the union as sole bargaining agent in the 20 struck plants, and for all its members in the other plants, and agreed not to deal with any other group for at least 6 months. The union felt confident, and was later proved correct, that this was enough time to assure an overwhelming UAW majority in the GM chain. All union members were to be rehired and would suffer no discrimination because of union activity. Union buttons, a real organizing tool at the time, were permitted to be worn inside the plants. Formerly, workers had been fired on the spot for pinning one on. The injunctions were dropped. Negotiations would begin in 5 days on wages and working conditions. GM immediately raised wages 5 cents an hour in the hope of, quote, taking the play away from the union, unquote. But nearly all the workers traced this $25 million increase directly to the UAW victory. After much debate in all the plants, the sit-downers approved the agreement. At 5 p.m. on February 11th, the whistle sounded full blast, and the evacuation of Fisher Body number 1 began. The thousands waiting outside cheered as Bud Simmons headed up the line of workers coming out under a huge sign bearing the declaration, "Victory is ours." All the strikers carried bundles of belongings on their backs. Waves of defending cheers resounded as entire families leaped at the men, marching like a conquering army. Lines formed in the 2-mile parade to the other plants began. As the double row of marchers reached the top of the hill facing Fisher number 2 and Chevy number 4, great flares lit up the area. Confetti poured down and the huge gates of number 4 opened. When Fisher number 2 had emptied, the cheering and noise exceeded all bounds of hearing. The thousands sang Solidarity Forever as they surged into 3rd Ave. A human flood headed for the center of the city. They had made Flint a union town.
And with that, we'll break for our last round of questions and comments. We actually we had more that we originally wanted to put in this, but there was so much we just decided it was best to cut. There was a lot of implications. There was a lot. The winning of this strike had a lot of implications for the labor movement. There were massive strikes throughout the country around this time, and a lot of groups ended up winning their strikes because of what went down in Flint. In fact, Chrysler and Ford gave recognition to the union because they didn't want Flint to happen to them. So this was a major achievement in the labor movement. And when he was doing the reading there, mentioned when he read that letter that the worker sent to the Governor Murphy, how empowering that was. That is why we find it so important to have these classes, to have this school, because so many workers don't remember, don't know. We're never taught the history of the labor movement in this country, among other things. But we're at a time where workers are beaten and battered. I remember a couple of years ago, we had that one woman that died in her car because she was basically living out of her car, traveling between 3 jobs every day. Workers have been battered, like workers. The state of the working class right now in the U.S. is not much better than it was before the surge in the organizing of the CIO. So these classes, we need them to remind our workers of today how we fought and won, and that we could do it again. So anybody have questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm aware from our last presentation or your last presentation that sit-down strikes are illegal, but does that mean we couldn't do them still and win anyway? I mean, we've defied law in the past. What does that look like for the workers?
The easiest answer to that, and excuse my language, we need a rank and file leadership that has the balls to lead it. I mean, it's not going to work in all scenarios, but I'm sure there are situations where it can work, and it shouldn't just be tried everywhere and be a one-size-fit-all approach. But if there's a strategic place where it could work, by all means, it just takes the balls to do it.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for the class because and like echo that as well because I mean in all of these classes it's always shocking to me like wow like that really happened like in the US like that's how workers organize and how they like I don't know you kind of just hear that we have or there's these industries that have such good benefits and have where these workers have such good benefits and you kind of at least from me growing up kind of just think like oh it's just like boom like it was like oh like daisies and roses but no people like really like worked hard put their lives on the line and organized in these I mean really great ways.
And you could see that these jobs with great benefits that aren't union, they don't have that, because the bosses are generous. That happened because either somebody else in the industry unionized and they need to keep up, or there was a unionization campaign somewhere along their line and they had to give something in order to keep it at bay.
Hearing about these strikes, especially concerning the sit-down strike of the UAW, I know that the stand-up strikes recently took inspiration, obviously, but especially when you mentioned how there were basically like fake plans to throw off the company. I believe that they did a similar thing with the UAW and the stand-up strikes in order to catch them off guard. Can anybody confirm that for me, or is there any other parallels to the recent strikes and the sit-down strike of yesteryear?
It wasn't fake plans per se, but like at the beginning, the first few weeks, they would announce what locations were going out on strike at the same time, the same day of the week. I believe it was Fridays at noon. The companies caught on, planned ahead for the place that would get closed, and they were able to adjust. So then what the union did in response, in fact, it happened outside of, I think it was General Motors. I'm not 100% sure on that. When they were there for a bargaining session, they didn't get the agreement they wanted. They walked out of the office, and Sean Fain from outside the office on the union property announced the biggest locations for that company were going on strike. I believe it was GM. I'm not 100% sure. It might have been Ford, and when he called off the Kentucky truck plant, but I could be getting them mixed up. My memory isn't exactly perfect, but that was a similarity there. It wasn't that it was fake plans, but they did adjust to try to keep the company off guard.
Thanks. Yeah. I heard someone ask it, are these illegal strikes, can they win? And they have one here in Massachusetts, and the Andover local, which is the most recent one of our strikes in the Mass Teachers Association, won 60% increases in pay for the lowest paid workers. That's 60%. So they can win. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that striking and winning in the workplace is going to amount to what we want, which is an overall working class victory and building working class power in outside of the workplace as well and between workers. And that's why I joined. We need to build that. So we need to be in there as we're fighting for labor victories, to be bringing these conversations into that as well. And I think we can definitely do it. I mean, labor it's different conditions now. We don't have a lot of these strikes aren't happening in huge factories, although the UAW is obviously, but there's a lot of other labor action happening in kind of service industries and education and different types of industries, but the same basic power dynamic is there. We can win, and we for our class as well as our workplace.
To add on to that real quick, it wasn't a sit-down strike, and of course it was teacher strike throughout the country. The strike wave started, what was it, 2018, with the mass wildcat strikes throughout the country, and those were victories for the teachers, and those were all illegal strikes. So just because a strike is outlawed doesn't mean it can't work. But again, it can't be rushed, can't be on a whim. Yes, a large part of the Flint Down strike that was spontaneous because it was when the conditions presented itself. But while the actual walking out might have been spontaneous, the planning was already in the works and it was planned to happen at some point. They just not exactly at the moment where it happened because the conditions presented itself. It needed to happen at that time.
Yes, was sit-down strikes banned on in the Taft-Hartley Act, or has it always been illegal?
I believe it was Taft-Hartley. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
It could have been included in the NLRA before that, but I don't believe it was. It was the Taft-Hartley that really shut down a lot of the strikes. But at this point, I know you said earlier you missed the Wednesday class. When the recording comes out on YouTube, it's gonna have both these classes on it. I suggest you go and look. We did talk about this then. There was no laws for sit down strikes. Yeah, they had happened sporadically in the past, but it really wasn't something that people thought of, so they weren't prepared. GM, the city of Flint, the state of Michigan, even the country was not prepared for it.
Okay,
And
thanks.
and overwhelmingly nationwide, the support was for the strikers.
I mentioned before that what happened before there was just a level of militancy that was just on another level, but at the same time, there was decades of militant class oriented trade unionists building up the labor movement to where it got to organize Flint. So it's not impossible for us to see that level of militancy again. It just requires the stubborn, not so glamorous work of building militant class oriented trade union organizations and elevating that consciousness of the labor movement. And so that's why we're here. That's why we have the Harry Bridges School of Labor. And so what we learn here, we can apply to our own unions. So I want to thank everyone for coming tonight.
And with that, we'll go to our wrap-up slides. And of course, once again, the Harry Bridges School of Labor is presented by Labor United Educational League. And you can find us on various social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at Louisville_US, on Instagram at Louisville.us, on Facebook at LaborUnited.Louisville. And of course, you can find all past classes, the Harry Bridges School of Labor, on YouTube at Labor United. And of course, our website is Louisville.us. And you can find our publication at labortoday.louisville.us. Several times a week. It's not always every day, but there's always at least three or four updates every week minimum. So please check out Labor Today. And if you haven't already, please sign up on Labor Today for our e-blast every Monday morning at 8 a.m. And e-blast goes out with our articles from the prior week. So to keep you up to date on everything that's going on in the labor movement, just check that out. And to close us out tonight, the song of the Flint Sit-Down Strike. Take it away.